Good afternoon and welcome to our latest dialogue hosted by the Herald and Nelson Mandela University's CANRAD department. This is our first dialogue for the year. For many of you who have been following us over the years, you would know that we have a long-standing relationship with CANRAD through the Nelson Mandela University, where we host a number of dialogues, sparking important conversations that need to be held. And another important conversation that we'll be hosting today is discussing 28 years of freedom and democracy in South Africa. Such an important discussion. Many have, a lot of opinions about it. Some people say the government of today has not done much. Many people, obviously have different views and feel that the government of today has done a lot, but the current crop of leadership is not necessarily doing what needs to be done in order to take us forward as a country. We'll be having this very fruitful discussion today with some important commentators who are out there, renowned and experienced, and have a lot to say. But I'm not going to give anything else away. I'm going to hand over to Christi van der Westhuizen, who will be the moderator today. Please do join in, send through your questions and your comments, and do actually just enjoy this discussion with us today. Thank you. Over to you, Christi.
Thank you so much, Rochelle. As Rochelle says, I'm Christi van der Westhuizen. I'm an associate professor with the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. And you are very welcome in joining us today, for which I think will be a very interesting and also important conversation, a bit of a stock taking and a bit of a reflection on where we are at, particularly looking at the governing party, the African National Congress. So our topic is, and this is our, as Rochelle has said, our latest Herald and Nelson Mandela University Community Dialogue, and the topic is Democracy and Service Delivery, 28 years on with the ANC in state power. So of course, we know that various challenges have beset the ANC in government, starting, of course, and this is something that we must remember, this we cannot forget the fact that the party in government started with the inheritance of an apartheid state that was fragmented, also in relation to service delivery, fragmenting service delivery in relation to use on the basis of race, and specifically in a very unjust and unequal way. And that was the first task at hand, was to address your duplication of services according to race, and to create a truly unitary state. And one would say, arguably, that there was quite a strong start in the 1990s. Also, many important pieces of legislation passed on the basis of our 1996 constitution, which is a unique constitution. People always refer to it as liberal democratic. In fact, it's got strong socioeconomic rights contained in it. Some would say perhaps not going far enough, given that it's based on the principle of progressive realization. But still, this is a unique constitution in terms of the kinds of rights that are combined, and also, of course, with human dignity as the central value in that constitution. On the basis of that, many very strong and innovative also legislation pieces being adopted in the late 1990s into the early 2000s. We also reached a strong economic growth level of around 5%. This was in President Thabo Mbeki's era as leader of the country. And we actually came to a point where we were actually creating jobs, which we know is our primary challenge that we have not been able to be consistent with. But of course, the economic and financial crisis at a global level struck us as well in 07-08. And then even possibly worse than that, the tsunami, or what President Ramaphosa has referred to as the 9 lost years of the Jacob Zuma presidency. And we have seen a massive surge in corruption. We've seen infrastructure collapse, a collapse in services, and so forth. So yes, so many challenges that we have to address today. We have seen that South Africans have punished the ANC at the ballot box since the 2004 election, which was the high point in terms of support. And since then, we've had ever decreasing majorities for the ANC. And it would seem as though we are steering towards a coalition government in the 2024 election. So, yeah, we've got our hands full, lots to talk about. I'm very, very happy to say that we've got two great thinkers, and particularly our first speaker that I will be introducing, Mr. Moeletsi Mbeki, who I think almost needs absolutely no introduction. I'm very, very, very happy to have you here with us today, Mr. Mbeki. He's a political analyst, he's an author, he's an entrepreneur, he's director of several companies, including KMM Investments and KMM Review Publishing and so forth. He's also the author of a number of books, including Architects of Poverty, Why African Capitalism Needs Changing. He also edited Advocates for Change, How to Overcome Africa's Challenges. And he has authored a manifesto for social change, How to Save South Africa. He's the national chairperson of the South African Institute for International Affairs. He's also a former member of the Council of the International Institute for Strategic Studies, based in London, and a long list of achievements, and able to welcome Mr. Mbeki today with us. And then we're also joined by Songezo Zibi, who's I was a journalist in a former life, and it seems Songezo has also made the jump to different pastures. I won't say better pastures necessarily, but different pastures. I think people know him particularly as former editor of Business Day newspaper, which has always been an important voice in South Africa. But he's nowadays connected to the Rivonia Circle as a co-founder. And the Rivonia Circle is a non-profit company with the purpose to develop political, economic, society engagement and action as the country heads towards a potentially chaotic coalition government in 2024, says the website. So he's a writer. He's also serving in several other non-profit companies. He's also on the board of the Center for Development and Enterprise, which is based in Johannesburg. And he has completed a book with the title Raising the Bar, Hope and Renewal in South Africa, which I think is something that we all need. So, Mr. Mbeki, without further ado, let me hand over to you. Our speakers will address us each for 10 minutes, and then we really want to hear from you as our audience. And for that, in terms of accessing the conversation and participating in it, please add your questions into the chat function, and do remember the basic house rules of treating each other with respect and dignity. And but otherwise,
thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Can I just add a little bit to your biography of Songezo and myself? We are both what Helen Ziller calls refugees from the Eastern Cape. I was old Transkei and I now live in Gauteng, so I qualify to be Helen Ziller's refugee. So I'm a refugee to Gauteng, and Songezo also is one of those refugees. So you are having a panel
back to the Eastern Cape, it's clear.
Today. Definitely, we will return. We will return. This topic which we have been given, I think it's a very fascinating topic. It's a very complex topic. I think that Mr. Nelson Mandela would have been very proud about the Nelson Mandela University, which is named after him for producing such complex topics. Because the topic which you put in front of us is very appropriate topic, but it's very difficult topic to disentangle. Service delivery is not an economic development strategy. The ANC's service delivery is a consumption agenda that does not lead to development, however charitable its intentions are towards the poor. This explains why South Africa, under the ANC's consumption-driven policies, has stagnated and is even regressing economically. Economic development, on the other hand, is driven by improving production techniques along the length and breadth of society. This is achieved by high levels of fixed investment in an economy, which goes hand in hand with a functional education system. So what is democracy? Let's start there. Democracy is ruled by political parties who are selected through a competitive election process to form a government which decides on policies of the state. For political parties to function, a country must have suffrage, preferably universal suffrage. For democracy to function, there must be periodic elections that are held under the same conditions for all participating parties. Interestingly, President Abraham Lincoln, the famous American who abolished slavery, had his own definition of democracy. In his famous Gettysburg Address of November 19, 1863, during the American Civil War, he said democracy was government of the people, by the people, for the people. So I think what Lincoln had in mind was that all citizens belong to political parties, so or were free to belong to political parties. Now, a political party is an institution that is created by individuals who have similar interests with the purpose of influencing the actions of the state in their favor. Many South Africans, however, do not understand who the ANC is, where it comes from, where it is taking the country to, and why. So I thought this is important for our conversation, for me to try and give, albeit very short, perspective on who the ANC is. The roots of the ANC go back to the mid-19th century in the Eastern Cape and Natal. Unable to defeat the Xhosa and the Khoi, the British established military alliances amongst sections of the native populations. In return for fighting on the side of the British Army, these groups received part of the conquered land and cattle. Our friends in EFF the other day were demonstrating, saying that the Afrikaners stole the land from the Africans. They didn't steal it, they conquered it, and it makes a huge difference. They therefore constituted the foundations of peasant agriculture, which gradually produced African commercial farmers and an emerging middle class of Christian converts. This class was able to vote under the 1853 Cape Constitution. The military alliance became superfluous after the defeat of native peoples, and the British gradually had less need for this class after the discovery of diamonds and gold, as they needed labor in the mines. Their political rights got steadily eroded from the 1890s onwards. You may all remember the Glenn Gray Act and what it was all about. In response, the more prosperous of the group established newspapers and what were known as vigilance associations to fight to defend their rights under the Cape Constitution. This new middle class was therefore alienated from the mass of the native population for having collaborated with the colonizers. It, however, became increasingly alienated also from its former military ally, the British, who, after the Anglo-Boer War, chose the Afrikaner nationalists to manage South Africa for them. This explains why the African middle class after 1910, but especially from the Second World War onwards, started embracing nationalism. So we have to understand what is nationalism. The ANC is a nationalist party, in the same way that the National Party was a nationalist party. And I will explain the difference between these two nationalist parties. Nationalism is a social and political movement that is driven by a deep sense of grievance. Population groups become aggrieved when they feel a strong sense of exclusion from enjoying the political, social, and economic benefits in a given society. In the South African case, we have two schools of nationalism, Afrikaner nationalism and African nationalism, both of which were aggrieved because of exclusion from the benefits of colonialism by the British. Nationalists, therefore, do not fight to change the socio-economic structure of the colonial system. They fight to be included in it. This is why the South African economic system, reorganized by the British between 1900 and 1909 to exploit the country's vast mineral resources, remains essentially intact to this day. Afrikaner nationalists, a coalition of landowners with traders and intelligentsia, gained control of the state from the British in 1910 on the clear understanding that the mining-driven economic system would remain intact. Afrikaner nationalists as landowners also use their control of the state to develop their commercial farming businesses and its related communication and transportation infrastructure by taxing mining profits. African nationalists, this is the ANC, a party made up of non-property owners, and it's very important to understand that's where the difference between the Afrikaner nationalism and African nationalism is. Afrikaner nationalists were property owners, they owned land. African nationalists were non-property owners. So African nationalists, a coalition of non-property owners comprised of professionals, traders, religious leaders, organized labor, and civil society. The economic system developed by the British, however, remained intact when they came into power in 1994. The ANC government used its control of the state to tax the rest of the economy in order to promote a consumption-driven agenda for the benefit of the African middle class. So you can see the difference. This is what service delivery is about. It is about consumption through redistribution. It is not about developing the economy. So what is the ANC's service delivery? To understand how the ANC's self-service delivery agenda operates, it is necessary to understand the social structure of South Africa, as this will explain how each class benefited from ANC rule. South Africa has 5 social classes, which I have identified as follows: elite, middle class, independent professionals, for-profit and non-profit, blue-collar workers, underclass, and the unemployed. So South African society is made up of these 5 classes. Each of these social classes receives something from the ANC's service delivery program. The business elite who wanted to move their companies offshore were allowed by the ANC government to move the primary listing and head offices to London. These companies were allowed to move offshore in return for Black economic empowerment for the African middle class. The primary constituency to benefit from ANC's ascendancy to power was, of course, the African middle class, which occupied highly paying positions in the state and state-owned companies. It also benefited from ANC government's legislation of Black economic empowerment, which compelled white-owned or so-called white-owned companies to employ the services of this group under BBBEE rules. Blue-collar workers, the underclass, and unemployed comprise the township population as well as the rural population of South Africa. The main beneficiaries of this group were the poor, who have become the backbone of the ANC vote. South Africa's welfare state was built for their benefit and to buy their vote. The condition of the blue-collar workers, Black and white, however, did not change. If anything, their living environment and job security got worse because of government policies that led to the deindustrialization of the country. I think I've covered my 10 minutes there, Madam Moderator.
Yeah, I've given you a bit more time, given that we've had some interruptions and so. And but I think we can take it further in our Q&A session. Thank you so much, Mr. Mbeki. That was, I can already see a vibrant debate coming out of what you've already presented to us. Thank you for that. And Songezo, are you ready to jump in? Thanks.
Indeed, yes. Thank you. Can you hear me clearly, Prof?
Yes, I can totally hear you.
All right. Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me. And since this is a reflection on the last 28 years, I will not repeat anything that my big brother has already said in this conversation, but I am going to center my 10 minutes on 7 very quick points, and they are quick. The first one is freedom versus democracy. He described earlier on, he quoted Lincoln as having described democracy as government of the people, for the people, and by the people, which is entirely correct. But more simply, I describe it as a system of self-rule, of self-government, fundamental, where we accept the responsibility of participating politically in political processes and in political institutions, specifically to get the outcomes that we believe are going to advance our individual, family, community, and national interests. What we attained in 1994 was political freedom in the form of statutory arrangements. What we did not achieve was democratization. And by that, I mean deepening the democratic culture so that democratic participation is seen as something that is done within and outside political parties, where the political parties and political leaders are seen as co-participants in a wider and deeper democratic system. The absence or the lack of that deepening of democratic action has resulted in some adverse outcomes, some of which we are now seeing in the form of poor service delivery outcomes and an increasing lack of hope and need for political change among the population. That is the first. The second is that it therefore had an impact on how people understood their agency. In effect, I believe that the population, whether they were voters or not, began to see their forms of participation as being entirely dependent on the political parties, and that if one is not a member of a political party, they do not have the opportunity to influence political outcomes in the society and in the political system. This is a weakness that needs to be addressed. Otherwise, South Africa's democracy is going to continue to weaken. That lack of participation has led to a situation where political parties, as all political parties do across the world, strive to capture political power so that they can proceed to become almost completely unaccountable. So the system that we have and a weak democratic culture have led to a situation where political parties are unaccountable outside of the lip service they pay when there is an election. The rest of the population tends to feel paralyzed in between elections, and there is a distance between political parties and the population that has led to an increasing rate of apathy at election time, such as what we saw during the last local government elections. The third point I'd like us to reflect on is the ANC's own philosophical or ideological understanding of the relationship it should have with the state as a governing party. That relationship sees the state as a sub-agent of the party, which is not different to how the Communist Party of Russia, with which it was closely allied for a very long time, operated. This relationship, this interpretation of the relationship has led to two correlated conflicts, one within the ANC and one between the ANC and the rest of the population. In terms of the ANC itself, this sense of undue ownership of state institutions has led to a culture in which party members and party leaders believe they can do with the state as they wish, which has sown the seeds of corruption. Cadre deployment, while it is necessary and allowed in various democratic jurisdictions, left unchecked and not limited only to the offices of the political office bearers, has had a corrosive impact on the ANC and on the state itself, because membership of the party almost immediately means access to levers of power and the ability to appropriate state resources for political or personal gain. In terms of the population, the relationship between the ANC and the population, as the ANC's ability to produce positive outcomes for the population have corroded together with the growth and corruption within the party as it relates to the state, people have also lost faith in the state's ability to do what it is supposed to do. This has led to the emergence of a new politics, which is the politics of powerlessness. We call these service delivery protests. In essence, people understand that if they try to participate in ordinary political processes, they either are members of a political party or they're out in the cold. And therefore, they consider at a principle level this to be a system that is inherently violent, and that unless they engage in violence and force those in authority to come and listen to them, they will not be heard and their voices will not count. This is dangerous for democratic sustainability. The fourth point I'm going to make quickly, it relates to political decay because of incumbency. And the relationship with the state that is too close has got the effect of diverting the purpose for which an extractive and parasitic relationship between political power and political institutions, political state institutions, in particular their finances. What this leads to is that it draws criminal elements into political parties and political structures because it allows them to engage in a statutorily enabled form of robbery, in the form of corruption. And that has led to political decay right across the board. As a result of this weak democratic culture, we have disorganized citizen agents who cannot find a way forward to create political change because they believe political parties and politicians to be corrupt, and that it is simply not possible to have an organized transition in terms of power from the ANC to any other agent. I will use one example as my penultimate point and talk about unemployment. South Africa's unemployment is structural. This means that the structure and nature of the labor market does not match the economy we have. In other words, in some instances, or in many instances, the unemployment is of no metric. That is a result of a failure of education and training outcomes, as well as a range of other structural, social, and socio-economic deficiencies in the system. And therefore, we cannot think of solving without sorting out the corruption in the state, without sorting out spatial development issues, and so on. That gives an idea of the structural political institutions, which is giving us adverse socioeconomic outcomes in the form of unemployment, decay of municipalities, and so on, which we are now referring to as service delivery. To the middle class that Mr. Mbeki referred to earlier on. In many instances, or most articulate agents for change in democracies are usually the middle and professional class. In South Africa, for various reasons, that is the most disorganized class that is not able to organize enough for its voice to be heard. It also happens to have the capability to make a profoundly positive impact on service delivery and economic culture, and the lack of agency and an inability to organize politically outside of the existing political parties, together with the working and underclass. We have a situation, economic metrics, and the political metrics are pointing in the wrong direction. Will the defeat of the ANC in the election collapse the entire edifice? Yes and no. Yes, if this lack of agency and organizing continues, and no, if there is a new decision to take the responsibility of leadership and build new coalitions that will put better alternatives on the table, not just in terms of policies, but the capability to govern. Thank you very much.
So, thank you so much to Songezo for that input. We've got two quite different approaches to understanding the current political situation that we find ourselves in. And I want to allow Mr. Mbeki maybe just a bit more time to connect for us the historical analysis that you've given us to the contemporary moment. In what way because I think it's a very interesting historical analysis that some people may agree with and others may not. I think there's lots of food for thought there. But do you want to just add a few words for us in terms of how do we understand how that historical context actually feeds into our current problems that we may be experiencing?
Well, it's very, very critical because South Africa, the South African economy first was created by the British as an extractive economy. And it remains today as an extractive economy. So there is continuity from literally from the last quarter of the 19th century to today about the economic structure of South Africa. South Africa according to my calculation, 65% of our exports are minerals and agricultural products. So it makes us into a commodity economy. If you add, let's say, another 15% from the automobile industry, then you can see the automobile industry is actually an enclave industry that has very little that is dependent on imports and so it's not really a fully integrated industry to the South African economy. So in real terms, the history of South Africa, we have, unlike the United States, a country that is similar to us is the United States. They were a British colony. The British set up the slave-owning economy that exported tobacco and cotton to the British industries. But the Americans broke with the British model during the Civil War in the 1860s. They dismantled the economic model that the British inherited. In South Africa, we have continued with the economic model, which is what explains our high unemployment. Mineral and agriculture-based economies are very low employers. And that's what is driving our unemployment, is that you get very high value products from mining, but they use very little labor. And it's the same with agriculture. Agriculture is employing, as it becomes more modern, it also employs less and less labor. So that is where the continuity is very, very important. So for the future, South Africa has to break with the British model that we inherited. And in order to break with the British model, obviously, in fact, one of the consequences of the British model is that South Africa is probably a net capital exporter today, as I'm talking to you. The other day, Anglo-American, which used to be a South African company and is now a British company, announced that it was issuing a dividend of 110 billion rands. But because it is now owned by the British, that money is leaving South Africa instead of staying in South Africa. So the British extractive model is still benefiting the British even to this day, which is why South Africa, in a way, is having to borrow instead of using the resources that are being drained out of the country, especially by the mining industry. I don't know if that answers.
Yes, no, it does. It does make so. So a big problem is that we've remained stuck in a economic structure that's inherited from the colonial period, and as you say, which is extractive. And when you give those kinds of figures around our agricultural and mineral exports making up 60+% of exports. I mean, that I think makes the point very well. I think that the counter argument that one would get from ANC people because what you are describing actually is also neoliberal capitalism and the whole process of deregulation, liberalization, and so forth, liberalization of capital flows, and the whole question of the relocation of headquarters of companies and so forth, which some ANC people would argue, well, the reason why we had to do that was because we didn't really have much space to maneuver in a globalized capitalist world in the 1990s, specifically if we now think of neoliberal triumphalism, in the wake of Fukuyama's The End of History and all of that. So that there's a limited space to maneuver. And in a sense, it was the ANC's attempt to get the capitalist class on board by allowing them these kinds of freedoms to maneuver. And in a sense, that has backfired. It's backfired quite badly. What would you say to that kind of response? That was the only way for us to try and get the capitalist class to buy into the democratic project, and they basically refused to do so, and hence have just remained on this very extractive path.
I agree with you. One of the characteristics of South Africa's democracy, all democracies are not the same. Every democracy is unique. One of the characteristics of South Africa's democracy is that it excludes, as Songezo has explained so well, it excludes lots of constituencies. And one of the excluded constituencies in South Africa's democracy is the capitalist class in South Africa, which is why the ruling class, or the ANC, as I try to point out, it's a middle class party that is using the poor and formerly the black working class, but the black working class has become disillusioned with the promise that things will get better, which is why the ANC has lost virtually all the metros in South Africa, because that's where the most advanced sections of the black working class are. So it's very clear that there has to be a new initiative that will include the capitalists, that is inclusive of the capitalists, which requires, for example, that we abolish policies of the ANC that exploit the capitalists. It's ironic. Karl Marx said the capitalists exploit everybody. In South Africa, the capitalists are exploited by the middle class through the policy of black economic empowerment. So we have to get rid of those policies, which will then bring the capitalists back into the mainstream politics and stop their exploitation, where they are having to transfer their resources to the African middle class, or more strictly to the ANC elite.
Well, I think that's quite a controversial statement, and I'm looking forward to responses to that. Please do use the chat functions on Facebook and YouTube to respond and to ask us some questions, make comments. You're very welcome to re-engage with us in this conversation. Let me bring Songezo on board, and just in terms of you've made some very pertinent points around how we've actually come to this position where the ANC has increasingly lost the trust of the citizenry, and also particular comments around the middle class, which I find interesting, and also interesting comments about the ANC's relationship to the state. And I think explain for us a bit more how you see this relationship in terms of the state, also perhaps with reference to what Mr. Mbeki was saying around production versus consumption, that the emphasis in our economy has shifted to this position of consumption rather than production. And one could argue that the relationship with the state is similarly approached, that the state is seen as a vehicle for consumption as opposed to production. State-owned enterprises, as we know, have historically played an important role in job creation and in production and so forth. We know that they're basically on their knees. So, do you want to come in and share some thoughts on that with us, Songezo?
Thank you, Prof. So let us talk about what maybe clarify the term the state. In South Africa, the state has three arms. There is the government executive, there is the legislature, and there is the judicial branch. There are three arms of the state. Colloquially, when we talk about the state, we talk about the government executive. I argue that the other two branches of the state, the government and the legislature, are suffering effectively from the same poison, which is the ANC's interpretation of its relationship with the state as a whole. Now, the difference between the judicial branch and the legislature and the government executive is that the judicial branch is charged with interpreting and making rulings on the basis of those interpretations of the Constitution only. The other two arms of the state have got the gift of political discretion, which means they can decide to make any policy decision they wish in order to make either their political objectives or their electoral promises. And this is where we have fundamentally failed as a country. The reason I am saying that the ANC's relationship with the state is problematic is that there needs to be a healthy distance between the party that is in government as well as levers of the state. Because what has occurred eventually is that the imperative to extract state resources for personal and political gain has had the impact of destroying meritocracy within the state. In other words, the need to put thieves in place of people who are going to enable thievery necessarily means that you must remove those who are competent and principled. That has led to an erosion of the quality of both the politician and the public servant, not because South Africa is short of talent in terms of skills and experience, but you have a political class that is electing to choose the worst possible people in order to continue extracting state resources for their own gain. When you have a situation such as that, you will have corrupt cops, corrupt other public servants, people who, even when they mean well, still make poor political and policy decisions because they are simply not qualified. This is at the heart of the ANC's decline in trust between itself and the electorate, but also the decline of the state in playing its role as an intermediator of interest in society. In fact, it became so weak that a family from India and a few hundred other people were able to capture and almost completely redirect the government executive and neutralize the legislature so that the project of extraction could continue. So that is why I am arguing that when you do not have the rules, especially in an environment where there is very limited political competition, you're going to have a distortion, such as the same political parties relying on the judicial branch in order to get things done because they are weak themselves. You've got civil society relying on the judicial branch to force the state to do work that it should do. You have instances where the judicial branch instructs the government to do things, but the government simply does not have the capacity to do them any longer. That's the corrosive nature of this relationship and its impact on service delivery.
Yes, you point out a very important thing there in relation to the judicial arm. As we know that there's incredible pressure, and I think that's why we're also seeing increasing pressures to try and influence the judiciary and to perhaps place individuals into the judiciary that may be more amenable to corrupt agendas and so forth. And earlier on in your original presentation, you mentioned the question of, what did we actually manage to do in 1994? I thought it was an interesting point that you made around, because the usual point is that it was political freedom but not economic freedom. But I think you shifted the emphasis in an interesting direction by saying that in a way South Africans have become too invested in political parties as opposed to thinking of democracy beyond political parties. And this speaks to me to the weakness also of our political elite, that they are unable unable to give the citizens of the country what they need, but the citizens of the country remain too invested in the political elite and in political parties. What is the answer to this dilemma? How can we deepen democracy in the way that you are talking about, in terms of where we have a democracy that doesn't merely hinge on political parties. And when I say political parties, I don't only mean the African National Congress. I do think that we've got other political parties that are, some of them are also very problematic, as we know.
I think we face two possibilities. I'll answer this question by talking about these two possibilities. The first possibility is that we find alternative ways of engaging in formal politics. In other words, new political alternatives. Already in the last election, we had more people registered to vote, who didn't vote, than people who actually voted, were registered and voted. That is a potential crisis of legitimacy, where the country will be governed by a minority, but it does not change the form of political power that we have in terms of the composition and structure of the political parties. The second option, I'm afraid, is Armageddon. This is what happens when the state and political institutions are illegitimate. People lose faith in them, and they use forms of vigilantism in order to get what they want. What we have right now is Operation Dudula. That Operation Dudula is a result of a political class that for almost 20 years has failed at the task of using the state and statutory instruments and bureaucratic competence in order to transform this society into what can deliver a dividend. Unfortunately, the masses do not sit around and carefully plot and plan solutions. They go and take what they believe is theirs. And that is the risk that we are facing in South Africa. Unfortunately, therefore, without anyone driving political alternatives to bring the people that have switched out of political participation back into continuous and deep political participation, we are going to have a president called Nhlanhla Lux one day. It will not be pretty.
That sounds extremely, extremely dangerous and worrying, to say the least. I want to bring in Mr. Mbeki as well here. I think Songezo has put a finger on the kinds of dangers that emerge and the kinds of risks that emerge, given the weakness of our political class, and given the inability to really address the massive socioeconomic pressures that we face, with 50% of our population under the breadline and so forth. How do you understand the grasping at something like an Operation Dudula? What is your impression of this as a political phenomenon? Should one simply see it as a kind of an opportunism that arises, if there's a vacuum in political leadership, or is there a political economic way of understanding the onslaught actually on foreigners from the rest of the continent? Because of course we know the irony is that the people who are being targeted are fellow Africans from the rest of the continent.
Well, if you read the article by the minister, the Home Affairs Minister, he wrote a long article in the Sunday Times a couple of Sundays ago. He points out that the trigger that led to the flood of immigrants into South Africa was the meltdown of the Zimbabwean economy caused by ZANU-PF. By ZANU-PF attacking the commercial farming sector, disenfranchising sections of the Zimbabwean population and depriving them of their jobs. So in this article, he gave a fairly detailed outline of what happened 2000 onwards. So the real problem, at the same time as Zimbabwe was destroying its economy, as ZANU-PF was destroying its job, controlling the borders of South Africa for whatever reasons. So the border control mechanisms that under the previous national control by the ANC, and they even removed the army from controlling the border and said the police must deal with it. So you have these two parallel things happening: the meltdown of the economy in Zimbabwe and and the South African government deciding to not to control the border. Now, the people who flood into South Africa invariably end up in poor neighborhoods, which and they put pressure on those communities, or those communities feel that they are pressurized. So that's the general. What is the solution? The real solution is to force ZANU-PF to rehabilitate the economy of Zimbabwe. Now, how you do that, that's another matter. But you have to force ZANU-PF to rehabilitate the economy of Zimbabwe so that this population, which lost its livelihood and live normally. So things like Operation Dudula are a spontaneous response by the citizens who feel pressure, adventurers and political opportunists who get into the fray. But the fundamentals is that population, the poor population, the ANC government gave ZANU-PF a safety valve. That's why they stopped to control the border, because they knew to population flight, and they deliberately, in order to support ZANU-PF, they deliberately opened South Africa's borders to it. It will not affect the middle class, but they are putting that cost on the poor in the townships in South Africa. So that is this kind of a bargain for things like Operation Dudula, the so-called xenophobia uprisings and what have you. So the ANC has been playing a very treacherous double game in Zimbabwe, which it is now ripping the whirlwind out.
Is this an example of some kind of short-termism that they couldn't foresee the massive fallout that this would have, and because it's interesting that was a purposeful, in a sense, assistance to ZANU to help ZANU of Zimbabwe.
Oh, absolutely. Remember who ZANU-PF's enemy was. It was a party set up by civil society and, ironically, by the capitalists, like the Commercial Farmers Union in Zimbabwe. So the ANC did not want a party of trade unions in particular winning an election, because they feared that will encourage the likes of nations to roll out a political party of their own. So the ANC had a vested interest in ZANU-PF staying in power, and they were willing for South Africa to pay that who they directed the cost towards.
So in terms of manipulation of the state and state agencies and so forth, we know that the intelligence services had a hand in the July or protests, or I think we're still trying to settle on a term for what happened in July last year. And in this case, it sounds to me like you basically saying that home affairs, immigration, and so forth being used again for nefarious ends. Let me bring Songezo in here. Songezo, how do you make sense of it? Please respond to what Mr. Mbeki has just been saying. And you also made an important point earlier on about how readily South Africans grab politics. Elaborate a bit more for us on that point, but I would first love to hear your what you think of what Mr. Mbeki has been saying around South Africa's relationship with ZANU-PF and how they might have even, our government might have even facilitated the flood of.
I think we all remember in the early 2000s when the Zimbabwean crisis exploded and South Africa was in to play a credible media. The ANC government did no such thing. It was not an honest broker in the Zimbabwean crisis. It legitimized politically and physically violent means by ZANU-PF treachery as just to South Africa but to other parts of the world. In fact, the current chairman of the ANC and Minister of Mineral Resources, Mr. to go to Zimbabwe to make their combi and driven to Bay Bridge and chucked out. Subsequently, he said, of course, there is a crisis in Zimbabwe. It's walking our streets every day. That was a long time ago, before 2007. You cannot resolve a crisis whose existence you deny, which is what the ANC proceeded to do. And therefore, it was very convenient for the ANC to say, there is no influx of Zimbabwean citizens into South Africa. There is no problem. There is no problem. They were lying. Notwithstanding, there's a particular pointed hatred of Zimbabweans in particular. People voice it, they talk about it, you can tell there's a visceral resentment of Zimbabweans in years gone by. Now, on the point of violence, what I was saying is I wasn't violence. I was saying that instruments of power, do not hear them, do not listen violence, listen to them. South Africans know that if they burn tires and they block streets and so on, the president will eventually come and listen to their problems. There will be a task team that is established in order to deal with those issues. Otherwise, if they do not do it, then there will be no positive political outcome on their behalf. And this is what I was saying we've got to be careful of, because when people stop participating in elections, it does not mean they're not going to express themselves politically. They will. What they will do, though, is they will take to the streets. They are taking to the streets. They took to the streets last year in July. They are taking to the streets now in the form of Operation Dudula, and that is on top of the second 950 service delivery protests recorded that right now is in turmoil. But because we live in sheltered places, over the years, that things are not so bad.
Thank you, Songezo. So there's also that disconnect against the harsh reality of life when you're a poor person in South Africa, when you're economically excluded. We've got a few questions here that I'm going to combine. My colleague Rodney Buzach at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy is asking about service delivery in the northern areas here in Kaberga, and he's talking about water leaks. While there is a massive water shortage in the metro, you'll know that we've been going through a perennial drought over the past number of years, and at the same time we're losing a lot of potable water due to breaks in the pipes and so forth and so on. And he's questioning the situation with service delivery. And then we have a question here from Songezo, who's saying he's trying to understand the intersection between political power and state resources, and particularly how the intersection permeates in local municipalities and how it shapes power plays. So it's interesting for me, state resources ultimately are what are necessary for service delivery. So service delivery is all about accessing state resources, about the state enabling access to state resources, or resources that the state have control and management or administration over. So Songezo's question is sort of taking us to this question of how state resources are being manipulated and abused in relation to political power, how it's used, how state resources actually are abused in order to retain political power or to gain political power. Do you want to come in, Songezo, and make a few comments for us on that?
So I think the colleague, the question from your colleague, I think I can see the one about whether the service delivery issues don't impinge on constitutional rights. So I think that's the essence of it. Well, it goes back to the point that I was talking about freedom and democratization. Unfortunately, ultimately, in order to get positive service delivery outcomes, we've got to participate in the democracy. Politics is not procurement where you hire an agency to implement something for you and you can go on and do other things while that agency is busy doing it. And then when you come back, hopefully you will have the kind of outcomes you want. Democracy simply does not work like that. It means constantly being present, participating in community and others, such as obtaining information, asking questions, making submissions, and so on. Unfortunately, it works like that. Realistically, the people who've got opportunity to participate in such processes tend to be either organized groups or the middle and professional classes. The anomaly in South Africa is that the middle and professional classes usually both don't organize and don't participate in those outcomes. As a result, what you in those processes, as a result, what you increasingly have, because people are not available to be chosen, you've got unskilled or poorly skilled stock being settled with very serious responsibilities, and you do not get the service delivery outcomes you want. That is why I said earlier on, even when the government is trying to do the right thing, sometimes they simply do not have the capability to do the right thing, because they don't have the right people in the right posts.
And do you want to just come in with the question of power play? Because I take your point in terms of capacity. And there are obviously various questions or various reasons for the capacity problem that you've highlighted. But how does it feed in? Because it's we've had incidents here in the Eastern Cape, for example, where, for example, water tanks are hoarded and not made available to communities as they should. And you see councillors, in a sense, manipulating access to basic resources, basic commodities, one could say, that would help with the alleviation, for example, of the water scarcity problem and so forth. How does one understand the abuse of state resources, sometimes in very direct ways that actually have a terrible impact on people's lives, in order for certain political power constellations to be created?
So this is, can I go to what I said earlier about the relationship between the party and the state and how it is understood. So this is not new. I come from the KSD municipality. It used to be run by the United Democratic Movement and the OR Tambo district municipality by the ANC. The ANC used to systematically, regularly switch off the water supply to KSD municipality so that citizens or residents could be disgruntled with the UDM and then eventually vote for the ANC. Between that and paying people off to cross the floor into the ANC, they eventually convinced them to do that. This is the problem with an unaccountable politics, unfortunately, as I explained earlier on. If a councillor knew that if they do that, they will not be voted in next time, they wouldn't do it. But they do it because they know there is no political consequence. That's why it happens. It's not just a corruption. So the politicians, sometimes within the same party, within the ANC, actively sabotage one another so that that person can fail and you can have a new political actor in place to replace them for the reasons of extracting the resources of the state.
Thank you for that, Songezo. We are running towards the end of our time together. I want to ask Songezo to make a few final comments. Maybe tell us a bit about the Rivonia Circle. It seems to me like this is a direct intervention to address many of the difficulties that we've been talking about now. And after that, I'm going to hand over to Mr. Mbeki for his last thoughts, and I'll throw in another question. I'll be a bit daring and throw in another question there as well. But first, over to Songezo.
Thank you very much. Quickly, the Rivonia Circle is a response to what we're talking about. There is a tendency to think that if we simply have different political personnel at the union buildings, all our problems will go away. They won't. We've had the benefit of 25 years of this constitution and 27 years of this democracy. It will be 28 years later on this month. We now need to fix many things at the same time. We need to have the right policies. We need to have a clear definition of South Africa's political center as being social democratic. We need to have the right caliber of activist, politician, and businessman who's very clear and cogent about what the political center and South Africa's constitutional values are. And we need to practically come up with national priorities that will drive political engagement towards 2024. Otherwise, we may have 300 civil society organizations with 300 single issues. The country is in crisis. We can't afford to be pursuing 300 different things. We need urgent national priorities as a basis of political engagement. That's what we're about, and we believe that's what should happen in response to this crisis in any event.
Thank you so much, Songezo. That sounds like a very important intervention. And there is a website if people want to check it out, Rivonia, the Rivonia Circle. Do have a look. Mr. Mbeki, as we're rounding off our conversation, I wanted to ask you, and this might be coming in from a bit of the left field because we haven't really spoken about it at all, is the question of the national health insurance. So, given all of your comments that you've made so far, and the discussion that we've had of a middle class party ultimately that's not serving the poor. Or that is more exploiting the poor politically, as you put it. How do we make sense of the national health insurance? Is that just a bit of utopian overreach, kind of remnants of former ideological dreams that have stuck, or is this a genuine problem to try and address the very huge disparities we do have in healthcare in South Africa? And if you can combine that with your final comments, I would appreciate that. Over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am no expert on the national health insurance. I lived in England. I had political asylum in England for nearly 30 years. And they have the National Health Service there. But the National Health Service is contributory. So all citizens who are working, even those on the dole, have to pay part of their social welfare to the National Health Service. So the notion that you can get healthcare for free is misguided. It's not free. The National Health Service is not free. Those who are healthy contribute to it. Those who are working contribute to it. And of course, that's one of the reasons countries like the United Kingdom are so paranoid about high levels of unemployment, because they know that when you have high unemployment, then you are not able to sustain institutions like the National Health Service. In South Africa, we seem not to think that that's the case. My final comment really is the issue that Songezo has raised, which is the participation of citizens. This is at the heart of the next change in South Africa. And what this entails is that the proportional representation system must be accompanied by a constituency system. Van Zyl had a model for it. The Constitutional Court has said that something needs to be done about individuals being able to participate in but the best form of individuals participating is through the constituency system, because in a constituency system, although you may represent a party, but the party cannot kick you out of parliament because you get voted on your own by your constituency. So we need to have more, we need to have the introduction of a constituency system to run in tandem with the proportional representation system. That's what facilitates participation. Where you have a constituency system, you have to have constituency parties, and the constituency party elects a constituency member of parliament, and so it goes on. Now, those are the ways of encouraging participation in the political process, and that's what South Africa desperately needs. Thank you.
I want to thank Mr. Mbeki very much, Mr. Moeletsi Mbeki, for his very, very interesting and also, well, challenging inputs. I think that it really asks us to think a bit further. Also, given that it's clear from our conversation today that easy loyalisms won't get us far. We need to, as South Africans, become much more critical about development, about our economy, about our politics. And I want to thank Mr. Mbeki for sharing his insights on this. And also Songezo Zibi, who joined us, who also made some very invaluable comments. And he's currently attached to the Rivonia circle that people can check out. So from our side, Christi van Westhuizen from the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University. Thank you so much. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Rodney Boezacht, to do a final vote of thanks. Thank you to our audience for staying with us today, and to the technical team.
Thank you, Christi. Thank you so much, Christi. My name is Rodney. I'm the Community Liaison Officer at CANRAD. And on behalf of the organizing team, which consists of CANRAD and the Herald, I've been asked to do a vote of thanks. So first of all, I want to thank the speakers, Mr. Mbeki and Mr. Zibi, for taking out time for this particular dialogue, and also for your insightful and relevant contributions, which lay quite a good basis for a discussion or a dialogue on an important topic. And in fact, both of the gentlemen, the speakers, are not new, or they are known to CANRAD, as we have both hosted them before. So they are quite conversed with the aspects of community dialogues that has happened. And also even yesterday, Mr. Zibi was hosted by the university through the Department of History and Politics. So thank you again for availing yourself of this. Then also to the moderator, my colleague, Christi, thank you for your professional way of managing and moderating this particular session, and also to gather most out of the speakers and steer the topic in relation to getting answers in relation to the topic or the challenge that we are basically faced. But also to the audience which have made some time to be part of this. Thank you for your contributions, your questions, and comments within the chat box. Without you, then obviously there's no dialogue and no event. But I also want to wish to thank the organizing team, which consists of CANRAD and the Herald, for their continued commitment to bring relevant and meaningful topics to this particular platform. So thank you for your commitment to that. To the technical team, thanks always for behind the scene trying to do your best to let things go flawless. We know we had some challenges with the sound and other technical issues, most probably gremlins. That is sometimes not in our control, but out of our control. So we want to apologize to each and everyone that was part of this particular session for that. Obviously, we will work on it and minimize those particular issues in the future. So thank you, everyone. Keep safe and have a good evening, afternoon. Thank you, Christi.